Good morning, my dear students. Now we are continuing the chapter Reproduction in Plants, and so far we have studied about asexual methods of reproduction in very detail that include the vegetative propagation, right? So vegetative propagation is the method of propagation by using vegetative parts of plant, and we have studied lots of methods in that. And also what are the advantages and the disadvantages of vegetative propagation also studied. Now we are moving on to the next important topic of this chapter, that is sexual reproduction. We know that there are two types of reproduction takes place in plants and all other organisms. First one is asexual method that we have already studied. And now we are moving on to sexual reproduction in plants, how the methods of sexual reproduction takes place in plants. Before that, we need to know which part is involved in sexual reproduction of plants. Yes, very good. Flowers are the reproductive part of a plant. And the plants that possess the flowers are called the flowering plants. Now we are going to study about the different parts of a flower. Clear? So a flower consists of mainly 4 parts. An outer showy part which is called the petal. The colorful outer showy part is called the petal. And at the base of a flower you can see the green leaf-like structure. Right? And that is called the sepal. And then coming to the middle portion, that means inside the flower there exists the male reproductive part and the female reproductive parts. Okay, inside the flower there exists the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part. The male reproductive part of a flower is called the stamen. And the female reproductive part is called a pistil. Okay. So coming to the male reproductive part in very detail, stamen is the male reproductive part of a flower and it consists of 2 parts. Stamen consists of 2 parts. A top portion, the top portion contains the swollen part which is called anther. The swollen part at the top called anther, and there is a stalk. There is a long stalk for the stamen which is called a filament. So the stamen consists of an anther and a filament. Okay. And coming to the female reproductive part which is called a pistil. And that contains 3 parts. Pistil also consists of 3 parts. Stigma, style and ovary. The middle portion you can see here. This portion is called a pistil and it consists of 3 parts. Stigma, style and ovary. Okay. And coming to male reproductive part again. The anther, we know that the top swollen portion is anther and the stalk portion is filament. Inside the anther you can see the pollen grains. Pollen grains can be present inside the anther of a flower. Have you seen the pollen grains? Yes, pollen grains, you may have seen that the yellow colored powders in some flowers. Yeah, that is called a pollen grain. The powdery substance in flower, the yellow colored powder in flower is called a pollen grain and it is present inside the anther. Okay, and the pollen grain contains the male gamete. The pollen grain contains male gamete. We know that male gamete and female gametes are involved in the sexual reproduction. So that male gamete is carried by the pollen grain. Clear? And coming to the female reproductive part, we know that style, stigma and ovary is present. Stigma is the Stigma is the top sticky portion, the sticky end. The sticky end of the pistil is called the stigma, and the elongated middle portion is called the style, and the style connects the stigma and ovary. It connects the stigma and ovary. So the basal bulbous portion is ovary. The basal bulbous portion of pistil is called the ovary. Clear? Inside the ovary, there exists the ovules. Ovules are seen inside the ovary of a flower. And the ovules contains the female gamete called egg. The ovules contain female gamete called egg. And each ovule will be having a single egg. Clear? Okay, this is about the male and female reproductive parts of a flower. And based on the occurrence of male and female reproductive parts, the flowers are classified into two. There are unisexual flowers and bisexual flowers. Unisexual flowers contains either the stamen or the pistil. That means one of the sex organs will be present in the flower. Either it may be the stamen or it may be the pistil. Okay, uni means a single. So a single reproductive part will be seen in such kind of flowers. The examples for unisexual plants are watermelon, pumpkin, then papaya, etc. Okay, so that is about unisexual flower. And coming to bisexual flower, bi means two. So it contains both the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part within the same flower. It contains both stamen and pistil in the same flower. The examples are rose, China rose, then lily, petunia, etc. Clear? So this is about unisexual flower and bisexual flower. Unisexual flower means it contains either the male gamete, that means either the stamen or the pistil. But in bisexual flowers, it contains both the sex organs. Both stamens and pistils can be present within the same flower. Okay, then coming to the sexual reproduction in very detail, we know that it occurs step by step. The sexual reproduction happens step by step. So the first process in sexual reproduction is pollination. Then after that it is followed by fertilization. Then after fertilization there occurs the formation of fruits and seeds. And the final step is the germination of seed. That is the next generation. Okay, so first we can discuss about pollination in very detail. So we know that the fusion of male gamete and female gamete is there in a sexual reproduction. So how the male gamete reaches the female gamete? How they meet together? Yeah, that is happening by pollination. So pollination is the most important first step in the sexual reproduction. Without pollination, no sexual reproduction takes place in plants. Okay, so pollination is the transfer of pollen grains which is present in the anther to the stigma of a flower. Stigma is the female reproductive part. So from the male reproductive part, the male gamete is transferred to the female reproductive part. So the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. Pollination is of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination means if the pollination occurs within the same flower of the same plant, or the same flower or the another flower of the same plant, that is called self-pollination. I will explain it. If this is a plant and it contains two flowers, From this flower, the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of this flower on the same plant. It is also self-pollination. And this kind of, that means if a single flower contains both stamen and pistil, it is easy to transfer the pollen grains from anther to the stigma. That is also self-pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma on the same flower or the different flower on the same plant. Clear? Yes. And coming to cross-pollination. Cross-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower, from the anther of a flower of one plant to the stigma of the flower of another plant. So the cross-pollination occurs between two different plants of the same kind. Okay, so the cross-pollination takes place between two different plants of the same kind. But self-pollination occurs within the same flower or within the another flower of the same plant. Clear? Okay. So next thing is, we know that the pollen grains are the structures which is protected by an outer covering. For what? Yes, in order to prevent the dry and decay, the pollen grains are very much protected within a outer hard protective covering. Okay, and we know that in order to transfer the pollen grain from anther to the stigma, there are certain agents needed, like wind, birds, insects. Like that, there are certain agents are required to transfer the pollen grains from anther to the stigma. It does not occur automatically. It does not transfer here from here to here automatically. It must be carried by some agents like wind, insects, birds, animals, etc. Okay, so they are called agents of pollination. Agents of pollination. First, we can see how the pollination occurs with the help of insects. The insects like butterflies, moths, then bees, they are attracted towards the flower. The flowers may contain the colorful petals, so that the insects are easily attracted, and they may give the nectar for them. Nectar means honey for them. That is also attracted by the insects. So when they sit on the anther of a flower, when the insects sits on the anther of a flower, their body is dusted with what? Yes, it will be dusted with pollen grains. And when they reach on another flower they sit on the stigma of a flower, that pollen grain is rubbed here. It is rubbed on the stigma of the flower. So what will happen? Yeah, the pollen grains are transferred from here to there, from anther to the stigma of another flower. There occurs the pollination. So that is how the insects carries the pollen grain. And there are certain other agents like winds, birds, animals, etc. And the further detailing we can discuss in our next class. Okay, thank you.